Welcome, my friend, my companion on this night's journey. Before we begin, I have a small question for you. Where in the world are you listening to this story from? And what time does your clock show right now? Perhaps you're curled up in a blanket in a small London flat. Maybe you've just started your morning in sunny Sydney. Or perhaps you're somewhere in between. Wherever you are, I'm so glad you've chosen to sit down and let me whisper this tale into your listening ears. If you find you enjoy these journeys into the shadows of history, a place of mist, swords, and ancient ballads, please press the subscribe button so we can meet again on future adventures. For now, I invite you to find a comfortable spot. Set your phone aside, close your eyes, and let your breath slow, because we are about to travel to a land both breathtakingly beautiful and chillingly harsh. Imagine you are standing on a windswept highland where fog clings to the loch like a white veil, and from a distance, the sound of bagpipes echoes through the deep glen. Further on, ancient stone walls appear, weathered by centuries, bearing the marks of countless battles. This is not modern Scotland, with its warm pubs and friendly smiles, but the Scotland of the Middle Ages, where every day was a challenge of survival. Over the next few hours, as you drift into sleep, I will tell you about the people who once lived, loved, and fought here. We will see the deep-seated loyalty of the clans, the daily hardships of the villagers, the suffocating yet comforting power of the church, and the fateful battles when the Scots rose up against the colossal power from the south. But first, just let your mind drift with the scenery. The wind is murmuring through the heather. The mountain peaks, shrouded in clouds, look down like ancient, silent gods. The old oak and pine forests rustle in the night, sheltering the red deer stepping lightly over fallen leaves. In the sky, the stars shine brightly, unobscured by city lights as they are today, stretching on endlessly. And if you listen closely, perhaps you'll even catch the distant sound of a lute, a gentle melody guiding your steps softly into a dream. This is the gateway, my weary traveler. Rest now, so that tomorrow we may open the first chapter together, where loyalty and clan feuds begin to paint the blood-soaked tapestry of Scotland. You open your eyes to the flickering glow of embers, the gentle scent of peat and oak smoke in the warm darkness. Outside, the wind howls over the thatched roof, seeping through stone crevices, sweeping across the sleeping loch under a blanket of mist. The Highland night has a way of lulling you with its quiet sounds. The snort of cattle in the adjoining byre, the creak of leather against a post, and in the distance, the last note of a bagpipe fading, leaving a silence as vast as the glen after a rainstorm. You lie still, feeling your heart slow, because tomorrow morning you will stand among your clansmen, where oaths are spoken softly but are as heavy as stone, where honor is breath, and kin is the only armor in a world full of uncertainty. In the Scotland of that time, who am I was not a vague question. Whose child you were, which lineage you belonged to, what name you carried, that determined your place by the fire. Who would come running when you blew the horn for help, and who would call your name when the gathering pipe sounded. The clan was not just family. It was the social map, the welfare net, the first school, the final court. At its center was the chief, the man to whom every head in the glen looked up to for decisions. a landlord, a judge, a stern father, but also the last refuge for the orphan. Beneath him were his close kinsmen, the tacksmen who held land, the shepherds, blacksmiths, weavers, fishermen, and cowherds, a living social body, each with their part, breathing the same cold air and drinking from the same stream. As the sky turns gray with dawn, you follow the others to the grassy patch behind the longhouse. A flat stone, the oath stone, emerges from the purple heather, its surface marked with old fingernail scratches like an ancient seal. The chief places his hand on the stone, then turns to the waiting faces. He doesn't need to speak loudly. In a world where storms and strangers appear without warning, people learn to listen to small things. Honor, he says, is the only thing that follows us to the grave and rises with our name at every festival. The people repeat a single word, like the rolling of pebbles. Honor. You have heard stories of honor since you were old enough to chase the first calf of spring. A child who once stole fruit from another's garden grows up to repay it with 2 baskets to right the wrong. A man who, in his drink, spoke an insult brings the finest woolen cloth to his rival's house the next morning, standing long in the rain to apologize. In their language, a word is not just a sound. It is the bond that ties you to those who will fight for you. To break an oath is not just a crime. It is to cut yourself from the net that keeps you from the abyss. The clan exists because everyone knows that when the wind rises, no one is strong enough alone. But the very tightness of those bonds also makes the nights longer. For one insult can give birth to a season of storms. You hear the old women tell stories by the hearth of nighttime departures, when men wrap themselves in thick plaid, smeared ash on their faces, and moved like shadows across the boggy land to drive their rivals' cattle home. These cattle raids were once more a lesson in cunning than in blood. But it only took one misplaced knife, one cry at the wrong moment, and everything changed from the next day. They did not have history written with iron pens on thick paper. They had the memory of mothers, grandmothers, and men sitting under the eaves of thatched cottages, watching the rain darken the glen, telling their sons who they were. You will hear much about 2 families, the Campbells and the MacDonalds, not because they were more beautiful or stronger, but because their feud was like an underground stream flowing beneath the bedrock of Western Scotland, occasionally surfacing as a flood. Ever since an ancient king granted land in Argyll to the Campbells as a reward, the seeds of resentment were sown. The MacDonalds believed that land belonged to their ancestors long before anyone could write the word border. They watched each other through the mist, through short summers and long, dreary winters, and sometimes they watched each other over the blade of a dirk. On a night thick with wind, you were told of Glencoe, a name that sounds like a sigh between 2 mountains. In that valley, one long ago morning, guests turned on their hosts. The MacDonald men were killed before they could even tie their shoes, while the hearth embers were still red and the milk in their bowls still warm. The old and the young fled into the snow, where the cold cut like a knife. To this day, that event is remembered as a crack in the mirror of honor, for it was not just about blood, but about the betrayal of a shared meal under one roof, the most sacred thing among the Highland clans. You understand why, in the stories, the old men raise their cups not to get drunk, but to remember that no death comes from nothing, It comes from a twisted oath. But it would be unjust to see only blood in the shape of the clan. It is these same bonds that teach you how to belong. On festival days, you see men wearing tartan, the patterns carrying the colors of their glen, like a flag of the land, and women with hand-embroidered shawls, standing close together, listening to the bagpipes tell stories in a language without words. The clan bards, those who could remember generations longer than the winter road, stand up, their deep voices keeping rhythm with a clarsach, naming every person who has fallen, naming every newborn child, and connecting the two lists with a single thread. At the chief's long table, wooden bowls are passed, eyes meet, and for a rare moment, the valley no longer seems so cold. You also learn the art of fostering. Children sent to live with relatives, to grow up in different arms, learning different customs, so that when they are grown, they have more than one home to return to. This is how the clan fights loneliness, by never letting anyone have only one place to lean on. And when disputes arise, the elders sit in the middle, those with trembling hands, but voices as steady as rock, to calculate the compensation for the pain, not because money can heal a wound, but because people need a ritual to close what has been broken. Of course, it cannot always be closed. You will hear people say that a stray cow is a small war, and sometimes those small wars gather into a dark cloud that covers the season. Men carry dirks in their stockings, as familiar as the spoon in their pocket. Women know how to hide livestock in the mountain crevices when news of strange shadows appears on the other slope. Children learn to be silent, to listen for the sound of hobnailed boots on distant stones, to distinguish the footsteps of kin from strangers as they distinguish a downpour from a drizzle. A guest arriving in the night is always invited to the hearth, but the hand pouring the drink is often closer to the kitchen knife. And amidst all this tension, you still find moments of softness. When the barley harvest is done, when the cheese hanging from the rafters is dry enough, when the animal hides laid out in the weak autumn sun are cured, you hear laughter burst out like bubbles. The songs speak of rivers shorter than summer, of a stubborn cow and a boy waiting by a wooden gate, of a girl hiding a blue ribbon under her woolen skirt. In those songs, the clan is not an army. It is a large, noisy family, sometimes arguing, but always returning to the same hearth. You might think, if honor is so important, why do people still hurt each other? The answer lies in loyalty itself. Loyalty is like the knife you wear at your ankle. It saves you on a bad day, but if you're not careful, it cuts your own leg. A man defends his name at all costs, and all costs is sometimes the price the whole valley must pay. The best chief is the one who knows when to sheathe his knife, when to let the elders visit each other's homes, place a handful of salt on the table, and say, "Enough." Not every chief could do that. Some were too proud, some too drunk, some swayed by the hot-blooded young men pulling at their sleeves, urging them toward the fire. Thus, the history of the clans is also the history of backs learning to bend at the right time. You will also learn the language of signs. A wisp of smoke on the opposite hillside, a cloth hung upside down on a fence, a sprig of nettle stuck in a stone wall. Small signals that announce big news. In a place where not everyone could read words, the whole valley could read the sky, the grass, the water, and the color of smoke. Thin smoke means peace, a grandmother whispers. Thick, black smoke means someone is burning something they shouldn't be. You nod, trying to commit it to memory like a new song. In the blue light of morning, the chief calls out the name of each family, allocates grazing land, and warns the young men not to cross the boundary stream. He speaks of a death in the night in the northern glen, a man who fell while chasing cattle down a steep slope. He says it was an accident, his voice firm, like a small lock on a door that could open to a storm. You see a few slow nods, like the surface of water rippling gently when a pebble is dropped. Decisions like that, saying this was an accident instead of this was a crime, save a season from bloodshed. That is the true power of a leader, not to order an attack, but to know when not to. In the afternoon, the storyteller, a small old man with eyes as bright as stones washed in a stream, begins to tell of a young man years ago who tried to cross the boundary stream to herd fat cattle and was caught. The story doesn't end with knives, but with a bagpipe competition and a handshake. The old man smiles. You can't make an enemy a kinsman in one night. But in one night, you can make him sleep in your house without fear. The next morning, he will forget the way to your house. Next time, he will choose to get lost at someone else's. Everyone laughs, the sound spreading like smoke escaping a thatched roof. Then the old man lowers his voice, repeating the name Glencoe like a prayer. Never betray a meal. You feel the words like a pebble in your palm. Small, heavy, cool. In a world where written law rarely arrives in time, such words are the final anchor. Honor is not an impenetrable shield. It is a thick woolen plaid, woven from hundreds of fine threads, warm because every thread is intact, still trusting the others. You see a young boy sitting close to the fire, his eyes fixed on the chief's dirk, not out of a love for violence, but because he knows it is a symbol of responsibility. The blade is bright, but its hilt is worn. A good man sharpens the blade little and wears down the hilt much, because the part you must hold firm is not the part that can cut, but the part that keeps you from dropping it in a fit of rage. As the second night passes, you have learned to name the distant relatives in the longhouse, to know which family's rooster crows first, which dog gently nips at your hem, which flickers of fire belong to the blacksmith, and which to the barrel maker. And you find strangely, amidst all the stories of feuds, what grounds you to this earth is not fear, but the feeling that someone will stand with you when the wind comes. In the moment before sleep, you hear the afternoon bagpipes again. The melody is not urgent, not a call to arms. It is deep and long, like the path that follows the river, like the breath of someone tending the fire for the whole house. Loyalty here is not a shout. It is the patience of watching each other grow up, marry, give birth, grow old, and say goodbye. And feuds, when unavoidable, are also framed within an old code, where people still try to leave a small path for the next season. Close your eyes for a moment, my companion. Let the night wind pass through the thatched roof without carrying you away. Tomorrow morning, when the fire glows red again, we will leave the circle of the oath stone and step into the kitchens of the smoke-blackened houses, where the lives of common folk are revealed in sharp detail. Chapped hands, thick oatmeal porridge, the cheerful noise of children, and smiles as enduring as the stones lining the stream. But tonight, sleep peacefully, The footsteps of the herdsmen are fading into the fields, and in the sky, the stars are standing watch over the entire glen. A Scottish morning arrives, not with brilliant sunshine, but with a thick fog that blankets the valley, seeps through wooden door cracks, and soaks into your clothes. You open your eyes in a cramped, low-ceilinged, smoke-filled cottage, where the smoke from the year-round hearth clings to everything. The stone walls are damp, the thatch is thick, but the wind still whistles through, and the breath of cows and sheep huddled just on the other side of the wall is the only source of warmth during the long, drawn-out winter months. In this dwelling, a large family and perhaps a few relatives share a small space. At night, humans and animals sleep together under the same roof, the heat from their bodies retaining a little warmth. You hear the wheezing breath of children, the stirring of a small calf, and the crackle of firewood. The smells of smoke, straw, and earth mingle, so familiar they become the daily breath of the Highland people. In these homes, children had no concept of a leisurely childhood. From the time they could walk, they toddled after their mothers to the vegetable patch, after their fathers to the fields. A 4-year-old could mind the geese, and an 8-year-old knew how to herd sheep on the slopes. Their games mimicked the work of adults, holding a small stick as a makeshift plow, using stones as cooking pots. A child's joy was a seasonal festival, hearing the bagpipes and eating a rare piece of meat. As they grew, the work only became harder. Men had to rise at dawn to go to the fields, carrying heavy oak plows. They herded sheep on the hills, chopped wood in the forest, and dug peat from the bogs to dry for fuel. Their shoulders stooped over the years, their hands became calloused, and their breath grew heavy as their lungs filled with soot. Their lives were measured in harvests and winters. Few lived past 50. As for the women, they worked the fields while also bearing the burden of childbirth and caring for the family. A wife might have to dig potatoes in the field with a heavy belly, or bake oatcakes by the fire while nursing a baby. They mended clothes by the dim light of an oil lamp, weaving wool into simple tartan cloth to ward off the cold wind. At every meal, the mother often ate last, giving her share to the small children, because in times of famine, that sacrifice was natural. The Scottish peasants lived in black houses, so named because the kitchen smoke accumulated all year round without a chimney. The wooden ceilings were low, the thatch thick, and the floor was packed earth. A fire always burned in the center of the house, for both cooking and warmth. The whole family would sit around it, eating thick oatmeal porridge, boiled root vegetables, and sometimes a little salted meat. Whenever there was a festival, a roasted leg of lamb or a batch of smoked salmon was a luxury talked about for the entire season. Famine was a constant companion, a failed harvest, a livestock epidemic, and the whole valley would sink into despair. Sometimes people had to eat grass, tree bark, or even mix dirt with thin porridge to trick their stomachs. Children were gaunt, their bellies swollen from malnutrition, their eyes clear but sunken. Disease also lurked: smallpox, typhoid, and sometimes the plague, a specter of death that swept through villages like fire, leaving bodies on straw beds unburied. A small cut could turn fatal from infection. A cough could send a whole family to the grave. In that world, death was always at the table, never far away. And yet, amidst the hardship, people still found reasons to laugh, to sing, to dance. They held festivals at the end of the harvest, lighting bonfires on the hills, dancing in circles to the sound of fiddles and bagpipes. Children ran around with heather wreaths, and adults raised cups of homemade whiskey, warming themselves in the cold wind. At night, after a long day, the family would gather by the fire. The old man would tell tales of their ancestors' heroic deeds. The grandmother would sing ballads to lull the grandchildren to sleep. Her voice, deep and warm, connected the past with the present. Stories of love, betrayal, loyalty, and war all became a shared memory, passed down from one generation to the next. Now, imagine yourself sitting in that black house. Outside, the wind blows over the thatch, and the rain patters against the wooden door. Inside, the embers glow red, a bowl of hot oatmeal in your hands. The children rest their heads on their mother's lap, their eyes closed. The soft sound of a lute, the steady drone of the grandmother's storytelling. It all melts into a lullaby, the rhythm of the common Scottish life, harsh yet full of vitality. Here, your whole life follows the rhythm of the seasons. In spring, when the thin ice melts into small streams trickling down the rocky banks, you and your family go to the fields, turning over soil still heavy with the smell of damp decay. Oat seeds are sown like scattered prayers, handful by handful. Summer is short, the wind rarely still, and you seize every dry day to cut grass, dry wool, and patch the thatched roof worn by the winter winds. In autumn, potatoes and barley are brought in baskets. Dirt-caked turnips are piled against the wall for protection from the cold, and salted salmon hangs from the rafters. In winter, when snow covers the small paths up the hills, you sit by the fire, your hands still busy, carding wool, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, your hands busy to keep your heart from thinking about the approaching hunger. In the black house, handicrafts were the thread that connected winter to spring. You place a bundle of cleaned wool into a basket, using a carding comb made from roots and sheep's wool to soften the fibers. The spinning wheel turns, softly, steadily, like a mother's lullaby. From the fine woolen threads, you weave a coarse but warm tartan. The colors are simple: brown of the earth, green of the hills, gray of the clouds. The blacksmith in the valley strikes his hammer on the anvil, the sound echoing through the mist like a metal heartbeat. He forges horseshoes, kitchen knives, door latches, and sometimes a brooch for a bride-to-be. Every object bears the mark of a familiar hand. The knife hilt, worn down by your grip. The willow-woven basket from your neighbor, smelling of the early spring stream. A few times a month, when the clouds are thin and the wind changes direction, the path to the market fair appears under your feet. You hold a child's hand, a batch of freshly churned butter, a roll of wool, and a few dirt-caked turnips on your back, hoping to trade them for salt, lamp oil, or an iron needle. The market is not as bustling as in romantic paintings. It is the sound of quiet haggling, little laughter, and many nods. News travels with the goods. A pack of wolves driven to the edge of the forest, a baby born with breathing trouble. Far to the south, strange soldiers passed by and demanded half a village's barley harvest. You trade for some salt with a strange salty taste. The seller says it's sea salt from afar, carrying the smell of storms. At the market, a minstrel sometimes appears. They play a new ballad about a lad who carried a spear across the swamp, or a homesick bride. Their voice is as thin as a thread, gently stitching into the cold afternoon the feeling that the world is a little bigger than the valley. You stand and listen, your hands still clutching your basket. When the song ends, you drop a small coin, a pittance, as thanks for a moment of mental rest. Every season, besides the portion for food and seed, you must set aside the part that belongs to others, for the landlord, for the clan's reserves, and for the church. Sometimes it's not barley or oats, but a day's labor. You and the other men go to repair the wooden bridge, reinforce the dike, or haul timber from the forest to the great house. Those days are heavy with sweat, but light on the mind, as the murmur of conversation dispels the constant silence of poverty. On the way home, everyone is quiet as they pass a field of barley destroyed by frost. They know that this year, even after paying their dues, some families will have to eat thin porridge. In a place where written law rarely reaches, people live by custom and memory. Small disputes are settled before the oath stone or the oldest oak tree in the village. The elders question each side without interrupting or scolding. A wrong is compensated, sometimes with a young cow, sometimes with a season of cutting grass for the other person. The sentence is not meant to humiliate, but to mend the crack. Only when blood has been shed does the balance tip heavily. You learn that justice here does not wear a black robe. It smells of kitchen smoke and wet moss. A wedding doesn't always involve rings. Sometimes it's just a strip of cloth, tying the bride and groom's hands together in front of the community. Hand fasting, a promise spoken for all to hear. The dowry is not much. A few sheep, a small plot of land, a well-woven cloth. Women carry the family on their silent backs. They deliver each other's babies, lift the hearth when the flood comes, and know where to hide dried food where the wind can't reach. They have their own network, trading rare seeds, herbal remedies, and lullabies. When their husbands are away with the clan, they are the pillars of the house, keeping laughter alive for the children. Your meals are simple, to the point of being delicious. Oat cakes baked on a flat griddle, eaten with turnip soup, sometimes with a drizzle of melted butter. When there is fish, the smoke permeates the pink flesh. When there is lamb, the fat drips onto the coals, the smoke filling a corner of the house with a fragrant aroma. You learn to use everything. Bones are simmered into a sweet broth. Fat is rendered for candles, and intestines are used for tying. Brewing barley ale is an art that requires time and quiet. The wooden barrel is placed in a cool spot, covered with a clean cloth as if tucking in a sleeping child. The cold is biting, and clothing is not just for show. A thick woolen plaid is wrapped diagonally over a stiff linen shirt, and on top, a tartan cloak that can double as a blanket at night. In the rainy season, an animal hide drapes over the shoulders, shedding water like leaves. The tartan patterns tell the story of the valley, the green of the moss, the gray of the stone, the brown of the peat. Whenever you leave the house, your clothes are a silent covering that tells outsiders where you belong and who will look for you if you don't return. Children play building dikes with small stones and learn to count with dried beans. Girls learn to hold a needle before they learn to read. Boys become familiar with the smell of wet wool before they know the names of the stars. Their games are survival lessons hidden in laughter. The nursery rhymes are as short as a breath, a few lines repeated, enough for a child to rest their head on their mother's lap and fall asleep to the sound of rain tapping on the door. The wind in the highlands is like a wild beast lurking in the valley, unpredictable, strong, and persistent. At the beginning of each season, the whole family climbs onto the roof to add a layer of thatch, stuff moss into the cracks, and tie ropes around the wooden chimney. You learn to listen to the wind. If it howls long, the night will be cold. If it taps gently against the wall, the snow will come late. These lessons are not written anywhere, only in the ears of those who have lived through a full winter and still want to live another. War rarely asks for directions. It just passes through the valley. For the common folk, war is strange boot prints in the mud, the sudden silence of the livestock, a harvest with missing hands. You know how to hide dried food in a pit in the ground, covered with fresh grass. Women know to gather the children into the darkest corner of the house when they hear shouts outside. And then, like everything else, the war passes, leaving the wind to blow more strongly through the unpatched cracks in the walls. Amidst all this heaviness, people nurture small beliefs. A sprig of heather hung over the door to ward off bad luck, a smooth stone in a pocket to remember an oath, a coin hidden under the doorstep so the way home is always open. Hope here is not a grand declaration. It is planting another handful of seeds, even though you know the next season might bring frost. It is knitting another pair of small socks for an unborn child. It is learning a new song to sing someone to sleep tomorrow night. As evening falls, the fire breathes steadily, casting flickering shadows on the walls. You put a pot of water on, adding a few dried fragrant leaves. The steam rises, carrying the scent of a summer forest. Someone plays a fiddle softly on the porch, followed by the gentle tap of shoes on the earth. A slow dance. No need to look at each other to know the steps. The children fall asleep one by one. The old folks lean their heads back in their wooden chairs. You pull the tartan up over your shoulders. All sounds recede, leaving only the light patter of rain and the steady beat of your heart in your chest. Then, from far away, you hear the church bell. Not hurried, not loud, but clear. The bell calls another day, reminding you of another power. The power that watches over souls, demands a tenth of the harvest, and names sin and salvation. You open your eyes a little, looking at the dying embers, understanding that the lives of the common folk revolve not only around earth, water, wind, and fire, but also around the sermons and the cold stone doors of the church on the hill. You open your eyes to a gray, misty morning, the sound of the church bell echoing from the distant hill. The sound seeps through the fog into every small alley and thatched cottage, awakening not just the people, but also the invisible bonds that envelop their lives. The bell tolls long, deep, and slow, like the giant heartbeat of the entire community. The people pull themselves out of their black houses, don a thick woolen plaid, and walk up the damp path to the stone building, where their souls are weighed, and even the food on their table belongs to it. In this unstable world, only two powers were truly intertwined with life: the clan and the church. If the clan gave you a family to stand with, a chief to follow, the church gave you a promise: salvation after death. That promise was so powerful that people were willing to offer their sweat, blood, and the very seeds they sowed. The church was not just a place for prayer. It was a granary, a court, a recorder of marriages and deaths, a shadow that covered even the smallest corners of life. Whether you were a poor peasant or a wealthy noble, whether you lived in the fertile lowlands or the windswept highlands, you could not escape the hand of the church. Every season, when the barley was harvested and the oats filled the baskets, you knew that a tenth had to leave your home. It was called the tained, or tithe. Sacks of oats, wheels of cheese, even chickens and sheep were brought to the monastery. You might be worried about the impending hunger, but your hands still had to place the church's share on the long wooden table. Those who didn't pay, or paid too little, were considered to have offended God. While your family ate thin porridge, many bishops and abbots lived in grand residences, drinking red wine from silver goblets, their tables spread with white linen. This contrast caused resentment, but few dared to speak up. Because to oppose the church was not just to oppose men, but to oppose God himself, something no one dared to do in that era. Even the most private moments of your life were under the watchful eye of the church. A marriage was not considered legal without a priest's blessing. Divorce was nearly impossible. Children had to be baptized immediately after birth. An unbaptized person who died would not be buried in the cemetery, their soul left to wander aimlessly. The sermon from the wooden pulpit every Sunday went straight to your heart, both comforting and threatening. If you lived a devout life, heaven awaited you. If not, hell's gates were wide open. And between those two shores, only the church held the key. Anyone who dared to speak against the doctrine would be brought before the ecclesiastical court. Convicted of heresy, you could lose all your land, be imprisoned, tortured, or worse, burned at the stake in the public square, before the terrified eyes of the villagers. Those flames not only killed a person, but also burned a fear into everyone's heart. Never stray from the path laid out by the church. The screams of the condemned echoed in the wind like a stern warning, and afterward, the community would quietly return home, bowing their heads to the priest the following Sunday, no one daring to speak of it again. Yet, amidst the darkness, there was also light. You hear tales of Saint Margaret, an English princess who became Queen of Scotland in the 11th century. She was renowned for her kindness, piety, and compassion for the poor. She built schools, encouraged education, cared for the sick, and reformed the Scottish Church to be closer to Rome. It was said she often walked barefoot to the monastery, sharing her own food with the hungry. The story of Margaret was passed down through generations, becoming proof that even within the power of the church, there was room for love and compassion. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the public imagination was filled with ghosts. People began to believe that among them were those who had made a pact with the devil, and the church, instead of calming fears, became the one holding the torch in the hunt. Widows, folk healers, or anyone who lived an unconventional life could be suspected. You hear the whispers, "She cures sickness with herbs. She must be a witch." The rumor spreads, and soon soldiers would come, dragging the unfortunate woman before the court. Torture forced a confession, and finally, the pyre would burn red in the middle of the village. The people, trembling, were both afraid and convinced that this death kept the community safe from evil. Many innocent people turned to ash in the black smoke, smoke that seeped into every house, becoming a haunting memory that lasted for generations. But it was also the church that preserved knowledge during the Dark Ages. In the monasteries, monks hand-copied books with brown ink. preserving the Bible, historical records, and ancient music. They cared for the sick, gave porridge to the poor, and offered passing travelers a place to rest for the night. You imagine yourself standing in a stone scriptorium, the candlelight flickering on the walls, hearing the scratch of a quill on parchment. Outside, storms raged, but inside, knowledge was preserved like a small lamp. You awaken to the distant, urgent beat of drums, not the drums of a festival, but the marching rhythm of approaching armies. To the south, from the flatlands across the border, the kings of England had long cast their eyes on Scotland, a land of mist, fierce winds, and brave clans. They saw it as a wild land, a treasure to be conquered, a crown to be placed under their heel. And so, the wheels of war began to turn, crushing innocent fields and villages. In 1296, King Edward the Fern of England, nicknamed Longshanks, launched a full-scale invasion of Scotland. His army swept across the border like a flood. Heavily armored knights, long lines of infantry, Norman archers drawing their bows in the rain. Scotland's small towns were shattered in days. Villages were burned, and the Scottish crown fell into foreign hands. John Balliol, the rightful king of Scotland, was captured, stripped of his crown, and forced to abdicate. Scotland suddenly became a puppet in England's hands. The people lost not only their harvest, but also their freedom. But in that despair, the flame of resistance began to flicker. From the lower ranks, a little-known knight rose to become a symbol: William Wallace. He was not a wealthy nobleman, but a man with a burning hatred for the invaders in his heart. Wallace gathered farmers, shepherds, and blacksmiths, men who had never held a spear, and turned them into a daring guerrilla army. They fought at night, blocked supply routes, and ambushed supply convoys. The English scorned them, calling them outlaws, but soon they trembled at their audacity. The story of Wallace spread like the wind, a tall man with bright eyes, fearless of death, wielding a heavy claymore sword amidst the enemy ranks. In 1297, Wallace and his ally, Andrew Murray, led their forces to Stirling. The English army, large and powerful, wanted to cross the narrow bridge over the River Forth. Wallace waited patiently. As the English army poured across, trapped between the bridge and the riverbank, he ordered the attack. The Scottish schiltrons charged, blocking the front and rear. The bridge collapsed. Soldiers fell into the river, their screams drowned in the cold water. An entire mighty English army was buried in mud and blood. Stirling became the most resounding victory, transforming Wallace from an unknown to a national hero. People chanted his name, calling him the Guardian of Scotland. But the joy was short-lived. The English returned, stronger and more numerous. Wallace was defeated in several subsequent battles. In 1305, he was betrayed, captured, and taken to London. His trial was a humiliation, accusing him of treason, to which Wallace replied, "I have never sworn fealty to the King of England, so how can I be a traitor?" On the day of his execution, he was dragged through the streets, hanged, disemboweled, and quartered. His head was placed on London Bridge, his limbs sent to Scottish cities as a warning. Yet, instead of frightening the Scots, his death ignited a fire of outrage. Wallace died, but his legend lived on, becoming a beacon for the next generation. In that darkness, another name arose: Robert the Bruce. He was once seen as an But when the Scottish crown was vacant, he seized it and never let go. Robert understood that to survive, Scotland needed a leader who could not only wield a sword, but also possessed patience and strategy. Once, after a crushing defeat, he hid in a cave. Legend says he saw a small spider persistently spinning its web, failing time and again. Robert took it as a lesson. Failure is not the end, as long as you get back up. In 1314, Robert the Bruce led his army to Bannockburn. The English army, many times larger, was confident of crushing their opponent. But the Scots had a secret: the Schiltron formation, dense circles of spearmen, their pikes pointing outwards in all directions. When the English knights charged, thinking their horses' strength would be enough, they met a wall of spears they could not penetrate. Blood of horses and men splattered. The clash of steel echoed, but the Scottish ranks held firm as rock. All day long, the English army grew exhausted, then broke. Bannockburn was not just a military victory, but a spiritual one. For the first time, the Scots firmly believed they could hold on to their freedom. From Bannockburn onwards, Scotland was no longer just a wild land in the eyes of the English. They had to recognize the existence of a resilient, albeit small, nation. In the years that followed, the war continued, but the spirit of independence had taken deep root. The people, though poor and hungry, still whispered stories of Wallace and Bruce by the fireside. Children grew up with ballads of Stirling and Bannockburn. The name Scotland became a symbol of an unyielding will. When swords clashed on the battlefield, it was the nameless people who bore the consequences. Fields of newly sown oats were trampled by horses' hooves. Livestock were driven off as spoils of war, and thatched cottages burned brightly in the night, leaving behind ashes and smoke-blackened walls. A mother clutched her child and ran to the hayloft, her eyes peering through a crack in the wood to see English soldiers laughing triumphantly before the blazing fire. A father hid the last cow in the forest, hoping to save something for the next season. Children looked up at the smoke-filled sky, learning to be silent and to listen for the sound of strange footsteps on the gravel, to know when to flee. War was not just fought where kings wielded swords. It was in every kitchen, on every small plot of land. For the common folk, resistance was not a grand speech, but the tenacious act of surviving day by day, hiding seeds, baking bread from tree bark, burying dried food under the floorboards where looters couldn't find it. After Stirling, the spirit of resistance spread throughout the highlands and lowlands. Small clans, previously preoccupied with their own feuds, now set aside their differences to fight a common enemy. Men who had only known how to herd cattle now held spears. Women who usually wove cloth now cooked porridge for the soldiers. At night, campfires flickered on the hillsides, and ancient songs were sung to boost morale. Whenever there was news of a victory, however small, the whole valley would cheer as if it were a festival. And when news of defeat arrived, people would hold each other in silence, but they would not surrender. Robert the Bruce was not only a warrior, he was also a politician. He knew that to survive, he needed to ally with clans that were once his enemies. He married off his daughters, promised land, and used both trust and interest to unite people. Each agreement was another thread that tightened the net against the English. He also learned to use the terrain. The bogs, dense forests, and steep hills became allies of the Scots. While the English relied on their powerful cavalry, Bruce drew them into places where horses could not maneuver, allowing his spearmen and archers to unleash their strength. Bannockburn was not just a victory. It was a testament to intelligence and courage. On June 23, 1314, the English army arrived with absolute confidence, but the Scots had dug ditches and planted sharp stakes, turning the field into a trap. On the 24th, when the horn sounded, the English charged forward. The schiltron, the circle of spearmen, closed ranks, their pikes bristling like a forest of thorns. The knights charged, horses neighing, but then they faltered, were impaled, and thrown from their saddles. The ground beneath turned to mud, blood, and water. The Scottish war cry echoed through the valley. Freedom! As the sun set, the flag of St. Andrew flew high, while the English fled in disarray. The Scots, few and poor, had defeated the mightiest empire on the island. The victory at Bannockburn did not end the war immediately, but it was a colossal morale boost. It proved that freedom was not a dream, but something achievable. After the battle, the clan chiefs became more united, and the people believed their blood had not been shed in vain. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath was born, a historic document declaring to the Pope, "For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honors that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself." This was not just politics. It was the oath of an entire nation. In the Black Houses, the old folks retold the stories of Wallace and Bruce to their grandchildren. They described Wallace's proud gaze before his execution, told of the spider in the cave that taught Bruce perseverance, and recounted the roar of Bannockburn like thunder from the heavens. Ballads written about them were sung to the lute, traveling through market fairs, taverns, and down through the generations. Children grew up in poverty, but carried in their hearts the pride of belonging to a nation that would not be subdued. For you, the listener tonight, imagine yourself sitting by the fire. Outside, the wind howls across the highlands, but inside the small stone house, you hear the story of Wallace and Bruce. The telling is slow and steady, like the lapping of waves. The soft sound of a lute mingles with the crackling of the fire. Every battle, however fierce, is now just a distant echo. The sound of hooves becomes the slowing beat of a heart. The roar of Bannockburn becomes a lullaby wind through the valley. You feel your eyelids grow heavy. Take a deep breath and exhale slowly. Because that war, however brutal, paved the way for a nation to exist. And tomorrow, when we enter the next chapter, you will meet a different Scotland, a resilient nation, surviving through famine, disease, and war, yet still holding on to its identity and hope. You open your eyes after a long night, hearing the soft whisper of wind through the thatch, carrying the dampness of the glen. After so many centuries, after so many wars and famines, what allowed Scotland to endure was not just swords or castles, but the strange resilience of its people. They were poor, they suffered, but they were unbelievably tough. And the story of this nation, in truth, lies not entirely with kings or heroes, but in the steady heartbeat of the common people, those who knew how to survive, to sing, and to hope in the darkest of days. The people of medieval Scotland faced long, cold winters, where death was a frequent visitor at the door. But they knew how to endure. Roofs were thickly thatched, stone walls were sealed with moss, and livestock were brought indoors to share their warmth. They sat around the fire, eating thin oatmeal porridge, roasting potatoes in the embers, and laughing with each other to chase away the cold. Every laugh in that winter was a declaration. We are still here. And that is what forged the strength of a nation. Though poor and suffering, the Scots never forgot to celebrate. When the harvest was over, bonfires were lit on the hills, bagpipes played, and everyone danced late into the night. Women wore colorful tartan plaids, men donned their cloaks, and poured golden whiskey, the Uisge Beatha, meaning water of life. Those moments were a shared memory, etched into the collective consciousness. Children were taught that even if hunger, cold, and war returned tomorrow, today they could still dance, drink, and sing. And that memory stayed with them for life, becoming the lifeblood of the national spirit. Music was how the Scots kept their soul. At the chief's banquet table, bards recited heroic epics, telling of the past and encouraging the present. On the hills, the clairsac, harp, would ring out, and the bagpipes would play melodies both mournful and majestic. Gaelic music was not just entertainment. It was memory woven into sound. It told a child why their ancestors had to shed blood, reminded the old that their sacrifices were not in vain. In every song, you hear not just pain, but also a promise. This nation will not disappear. The people of Scotland knew how to make do in poverty. They made cheese from scarce milk, dried fish for the winter, and knitted sturdy woolen socks to keep their feet warm. Even in scarcity, they were creative. Sheep fat for candles, ashes mixed for soap, wild plants for medicine. That creativity was, in fact, a form of resilience. It proved that no matter how harsh the circumstances, people would find a way to carry on. The clan existed not just in war, but in daily life. When a house burned down, the whole village helped to rebuild it. When a family lost their crops, neighbors contributed grain. When someone fell ill, the women of the village took turns caring for them. This bond created a natural safety net. Everyone knew they were not alone, and it was this community spirit that kept them alive through centuries of storms. It wasn't just hunger or cold that the Scots resisted. They also resisted oppression. When the English king demanded their submission, they answered with the Declaration of Arbroath. We fight for freedom, which no honest man gives up, but with life itself. That declaration was not just for the Pope, but for the people themselves, that they were not just subjects, but a nation, and that freedom was worth more than any glory or wealth. This nation endured countless losses, famine, disease, constant warfare. They aged quickly, their lifespans short. But in that very suffering, they held on to hope. Hope was present in a hot bowl of porridge in winter, in a lullaby for a child, in the flickering flames of a festival bonfire. This duality of suffering and hope was the very essence of medieval Scotland. You have traveled with me through long chapters, from the oaths of the clans, the cries of the common folk, the shadow of the church's power, to the battles for freedom and the resilient spirit of a small nation. Now, as the night deepens and the fire is but glowing embers, let us sit for a moment, breathe slowly, and listen to what the past wants to whisper. Medieval Scotland was not just a land of castles and bagpipes. It was a place where real people of flesh and blood lived harsh lives. They were hungry. They were cold. They trembled before disease and violence. But in each of those short days, they lit a candle of hope and left a legacy that we can still see today. History, when you look into it, is like a dim mirror. You don't see every face clearly, but you recognize familiar features. The will to live, the love of family, the belief in community. These things do not change, even over centuries. Kings, generals, and knights may have their names written in history books, but it is the common people who are the foundation of every story. The woman weaving in the night, the child herding sheep on the hillside, the man planting seeds in a harsh winter, they all contributed to building the Scottish identity. The greatest lesson from them is this: strength lies not in great power, but in patience and perseverance. Surviving the cold, sharing a bowl of porridge, keeping an oath. These are the greatest victories that history rarely mentions. Though they had to bow to hunger and disease, the Scots never submitted to slavery. Wallace fell, and Bruce rose. When Bruce was gone, others followed. The Declaration of Arbroath Oath was not just a piece of paper, but a promise that echoes to this day. Freedom is not for sale. It can only be kept with blood and faith. That spirit, from the wild highlands to the misty glens, has forged the soul of a nation, small, but never to disappear. You, who are listening to these whispers, are also living in a challenging world. There may no longer be wars with swords and spears, but there are still silent battles. The struggle to make a living, loneliness, long, stressful days. When you look back at medieval Scotland, you might find a reminder. If they could survive winters longer than death itself, then you can also overcome your own difficulties. We all carry within us the strength of resilience, a small flame, but one that never goes out. Now, let the past lull you to sleep. Hear the wind through the heather, the call of cattle in the fields, the distant sound of a lute. Imagine you are lying in a small cottage, sheltered by a thatched roof, warmed by a glowing hearth. Outside, the ghosts of war and famine are but distant memories. Inside, you are safe, warmed by memory and faith. The whisper from the past tells you, people can endure more than they think. And whenever you feel weak, remember that there were once people who lived in far greater hardship, yet they still sang, still danced, still believed in tomorrow. Close your eyes. Let the story slow to the rhythm of your breath. Let the images of misty highlands, quiet lochs, and villages by the fire dissolve into your dreams. Tonight, medieval Scotland is just a story, but their resilient spirit, their oaths, and their love for freedom, all will remain with you, like a smoldering candle. Sleep well, weary traveler. The past has sung its song. Tomorrow, when you wake, carry its lesson with you. That strength lies not in crowns or castles, but in the human heart.